I watched through the security camera feed on my phone as my stepsister Hannah eagerly opened the sleek laptop box, the one with my name still scribbled on the shipping label. My parents stood behind her, beaming, as if they'd personally earned the money to buy it. They hadn't, of course. They'd just stolen it from me. Again. "Oh my God, thank you so much," Hannah squealed, throwing her arms around my mother. "This is exactly what I needed for college." My mother, I couldn't bring myself to call her mom anymore, not after everything, stroked Hannah's perfectly highlighted hair. "You deserve it, sweetheart. You've worked so hard." Worked hard, right. Hannah had barely scraped through high school while I'd maintained a 4.0 GPA and taught myself to code by age 12. But in my previous life, none of that had mattered. I'd been the unwanted child from my father's first marriage, the ghost haunting their perfect blended family. I leaned back in my leather chair, real leather, not the cheap stuff, in my corner office and smiled. Let her have the laptop. Let her think she'd won. She had no idea what I'd installed on it before I'd accidentally left it at home when I moved out 6 months ago. The keylogger was just the beginning. In my first life, I died at 26, alone in a hospital bed with no one to hold my hand. The official cause was heart failure, but I knew the truth. It was years of accumulated stress, malnutrition during my teenage years when they'd spent all the food money on Hannah's dance classes, and the constant emotional battery that had worn down my will to live. I'd started that life as Emma Chen, 7 years old, when my father remarried 6 months after my mother's death from cancer. I barely remembered my real mother, just flashes of warmth and the smell of jasmine, but I remembered very clearly the first time my new stepmother looked at me with cold calculation in her eyes. "Richard," she'd said to my father that first night when she thought I was asleep, "are you sure about this arrangement? The child support from your ex-wife's estate, it goes directly to Emma?" "It's in trust until she's 18, my father had replied. Her mother made sure of that, but yes, there's a monthly stipend for her care." "I see." A pause. "And she has no other family?" "No one who contested custody." Even at 7, I'd understood the predatory satisfaction in her voice. For the next 11 years of my first life, I'd lived as a cash cow and a servant. The stipend meant for my care, for my food, clothing, education, had been diverted to Hannah's endless activities. Designer clothes for her, thrift store rejects for me, private tutoring for her while I studied by flashlight under my covers because they'd taken the light bulb from my room to teach me about electricity conservation. When I'd turned 18 and finally gained access to what should have been $150,000 in trust, my mother's life insurance and estate, carefully saved, I'd found only $3,000 remaining. My father was the trustee. He'd drained it systematically, forging my signatures on withdrawal forms, justifying it as family expenses. I'd tried to sue. The lawyer had laughed me out of his office when I told him how much I could afford to pay. I'd worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college. I'd graduated with a degree in computer science, landed a decent job at a tech startup, and just when I thought I might finally escape, might finally build something for myself, my body had simply given up. 26 years old, and my heart had stopped like an overworked engine finally burning out. I'd died with $247 in my checking account and $50,000 in student loan debt. The last thought I'd had before the darkness took me was, if I could do it over, I'd make them pay. When I woke up, I was 14 again, in my tiny bedroom with the missing light bulb, and I could remember everything. The first few days after my rebirth had been disorienting. I'd stared at my hands, young, uncalloused, without the repetitive strain injury scars from years of typing, and wondered if I was hallucinating. Some kind of dying dream, perhaps, my oxygen-starved brain's last desperate fantasy. But the details were too sharp, too consistent. I remembered this day. It was 3 days after my 14th birthday, which my family had forgotten, and 2 days before Hannah's 16th, which they'd been planning for months. In my first life, they'd spent $5,000 on her party, money that had come from my trust fund, I'd later discovered, while I'd received nothing, not even a cupcake. I sat on my bed and took inventory. I was 14 in 2015. I had approximately $3,000 left in my trust fund, which I couldn't access for 4 more years. I was failing several classes, not because I was stupid, but because I was too exhausted from housework and too malnourished to concentrate. I had no allies, no resources, no proof of the abuse. But I had something else. I had 11 years of knowledge from a future that hadn't happened yet. I knew which cryptocurrencies would explode. I knew which startups would become unicorns. I knew which stocks would split, which companies would collapse, which technologies would disrupt entire industries. Most importantly, I knew exactly how my family would continue to abuse me if I didn't change my trajectory. I knew about the stolen trust fund, about Hannah plagiarizing my college essays, about my father forging my signature to take out credit cards in my name that he'd max out and default on, destroying my credit before I turned 20. I'd been given an unfair advantage, a cheat code to life, and I was going to use every bit of it. But I had to be smart. At 14, I couldn't legally open a brokerage account. I couldn't sign contracts. I was still trapped in this house with these people who saw me as a resource to exploit. So I started small. First, I began documenting everything. Every time my stepmother forgot to buy groceries for me while buying expensive organic food for Hannah, I took photos. Every time my father diverted my allowance, the $50 a month that was legally mine from the trust stipend, to Hannah's activities, I wrote it down with dates and amounts. Every time I was forced to do Hannah's chores while she went out with friends, I noted it. I was building a case, slowly and methodically. Second, I started preparing for financial independence. I couldn't invest in Bitcoin yet, but I could learn. I spent every spare moment in the public library using their computers to teach myself everything I could about coding, cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, and business formation. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman who'd lost her own daughter and seemed to see something in me worth nurturing. She'd let me stay past closing time sometimes, looking the other way. "Emma," she'd said once, "why do I get the feeling you're planning something big?" I'd looked up from a book on corporate law and smiled. "Because I am." She'd patted my shoulder. "Good. Whatever it is, I hope it takes you far away from here." Third, I began to subtly change my behavior at home. In my first life, I'd fought back against the injustice, arguing and pleading and crying, which had only made them crueler. This time, I became docile, compliant, invisible. I let them think they'd broken me. The first major opportunity came 6 months after my rebirth, on my 15th birthday in January 2016. Bitcoin was trading at about $400 per coin. I knew that by December 2017, it would hit nearly $20,000, but I still couldn't legally buy it myself. That's when I befriended Marcus Chen, a distant cousin on my father's side who was 23, worked in tech, and had always been kind to me at family gatherings. He was one of the few people who seemed to see me as a person rather than an inconvenience. I reached out to him through Facebook with a simple message: "I have an investment opportunity that could make us both a lot of money, but I need an adult partner. Are you interested?" He'd been skeptical, obviously. I was 15, but I'd been persuasive, sharing just enough technical knowledge about blockchain technology and Bitcoin's potential to intrigue him. I'd made him a deal. He would be the legal account holder, but I would provide the strategy. We'd split any profits, 50-50. "Where are you getting the money?" he'd asked when we met at a coffee shop. My stepmother thinking I was at a study group. I'd pulled out 10 crumpled $20 bills, money I'd saved from returning bottles and cans, from selling my old books online, from every penny I could scrape together. $200. It was all I had in the world. "This is my stake," I'd said. "I know it's not much, but I have a feeling about this. And if I'm right, in 2 years, this will be worth over 10,000. Marcus had studied me for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Completely." He'd sighed, pulled out his wallet, and added $300 of his own money. "Okay, $500 total. But Emma, if this doesn't work, it will work," I'd said with absolute certainty. "I promise you." We'd bought 1.25 Bitcoin that day. Over the next 18 months, I lived 2 lives. At home, I was the perfect victim, quiet, obedient, making myself as small as possible. I did my chores without complaint. I accepted the scraps they gave me. I watched as they continued to drain my trust fund, forging my signatures on documents I wasn't supposed to see, but which I photographed whenever I got the chance. Hannah was preparing for college, and my parents were obsessed with getting her into a prestigious school. Never mind that her grades were mediocre, or that her SAT scores were barely above average. My stepmother was convinced that with the right essay, the right extracurricular story, Hannah could get into an Ivy League. In my first life, they'd forced me to write Hannah's college essays. She'd gotten into Cornell on my words, my experiences, because I'd been too afraid and too beaten down to refuse. This time, I wrote the essays again, but I made sure to save copies of every draft, time-stamped and backed up in multiple locations. Meanwhile, in my secret life, I was becoming someone else entirely. Marcus and I watched our Bitcoin investment grow. By mid-2017, our $500 had become $5,000. I convinced him to take out $2,500 as proof of profit and to reinvest the rest. His trust in me was growing. "How did you know?" he kept asking. "Emma, this is insane. How did you know?" "I pay attention," I'd say simply, "and I'm good at patterns." But I wasn't just watching Bitcoin, I was building something bigger. On my 16th birthday, I convinced Marcus to help me set up a business entity, a limited liability company called Phoenix Technologies, with him as the registered agent and managing member, but with a private operating agreement that gave me full control and 90% ownership. It cost $500 in filing fees and legal costs, money we pulled from our Bitcoin profits. "What exactly are you planning?" Marcus had asked as we filed the paperwork. "I'm planning to be free," I'd answered. Phoenix Technologies' first product was something I'd sketched out in my first life but never had the time or resources to build. A proprietary algorithm for optimizing cloud server resources, reducing costs by up to 30% for small to medium businesses. In my previous life, I'd worked for a company doing this manually. I knew the pain points, knew what companies needed, knew exactly how to solve it. I spent 6 months coding the prototype, working from the public library after school, often until Mrs. Patterson gently kicked me out at closing. She never asked what I was working on, but she'd sometimes bring me sandwiches, claiming she'd packed too much lunch. By the time I was 17 in early 2018, Phoenix Technologies had 3 pilot clients, small businesses Marcus had connections with, and we were charging $200 a month per client. It wasn't much, but it was revenue. It was real. Our Bitcoin investment, which had peaked at nearly $25,000 in December 2017, had crashed back down, but we'd sold enough at the top to walk away with $15,000 in profit. Combined with our business revenue, I had my escape fund, but I wasn't leaving yet. I was waiting for the perfect moment. The trap I'd been setting for 3 years was almost ready. At home, things had gotten worse, just as I'd remembered they would. I was 17, a senior in high school, and my father had started talking about family contributions to my college fund, meaning he expected me to take out massive student loans that he would somehow gain access to. My stepmother had become more openly hostile, no longer bothering to hide her contempt when my father wasn't around. Hannah, now 19 and at Cornell, thanks to my essays, my words, my stories, was struggling. She'd failed 2 classes her first semester because she'd never actually had to do her own work. She was on academic probation. My parents were desperate to keep her in school, and that meant money. Lots of money. Money they didn't have because they'd already spent most of my trust fund. That's when they'd come up with their brilliant plan. "Emma," my father had said one evening in March, calling me into the living room where he and my stepmother sat like judges on a tribunal, "we need to talk about your future." I'd stood there, hands clasped, playing the part I'd perfected. "Yes, Dad? Your 18th birthday is coming up in June. You'll be accessing your trust fund then." "Yes, Dad?" Though I knew there was almost nothing left in it. "Your mother and I have been thinking." He'd gestured to my stepmother, who wasn't my mother, who'd never been my mother. "We've invested a lot in raising you, food, shelter, clothing, education. It's only fair that you contribute to the family now that you're becoming an adult." I'd kept my face neutral. "Contribute how?" "Hannah needs help with her tuition," my stepmother had interjected. "Cornell is very expensive, and it would be fair, since she's your sister, for you to help support her education. We're thinking you could contribute $50,000 from your trust fund." $50,000, more than what was left in the entire trust. "And for yourself," my father had continued, "you should probably consider community college. It's more affordable. You can live at home, help with expenses. It makes more sense financially." In my first life, I'd cried during this conversation. I'd begged them to reconsider. I'd reminded them that the money was mine from my mother's life insurance meant for me. They'd called me selfish and ungrateful. I'd eventually agreed because I'd been so broken down that I couldn't imagine refusing. This time, I'd simply nodded. Can I think about it? My father had looked surprised by my compliance. Of course, but we'll need an answer soon. I understand. I'd gone to my room, pulled out my phone, and texted Marcus. It's time. Start the paperwork. Phase 1 of my plan had launched the next day. I'd gone to school and, during lunch period, had visited my guidance counselor, Ms. Rodriguez. I'd brought with me a flash drive containing 3 years of documentation. Photos of the empty refrigerator beside the full one, the empty one was mine, copies of forged withdrawal documents from my trust fund, time-stamped essays I'd written for Hannah alongside her college applications, records of my father opening credit cards in my name, which I'd discovered through careful monitoring. Ms. Rodriguez, I'd said, I need help. I'm being financially abused by my family and I need to legally emancipate before my 18th birthday. She'd looked at me with growing horror as she'd reviewed the evidence. Emma, this is serious. This is fraud. This is abuse. We need to contact Child Protective Services. I don't want to go into foster care, I'd said. I have 3 months until I'm 18. I have a job. This was technically true. I was the primary developer for Phoenix Technologies, though the company was officially Marcus's, and I can support myself. I just need legal independence, so they can't access my trust fund or coerce me into signing anything. Ms. Rodriguez had made several phone calls that day. Within a week, I'd been assigned a pro bono lawyer, a fierce woman named Janet Reeves, who'd taken one look at my evidence and had immediately filed for emancipation and emergency protective orders. My family had been shocked when they'd been served papers. How dare you, my stepmother had screamed when I'd come home that day to find them waiting with the court documents. After everything we've done for you, you ungrateful little bitch. Everything you've done for me, I'd said calmly, my voice steady in a way it had never been in my first life. You mean stealing my inheritance, forging my signatures, opening credit cards in my name? Making me write Hannah's essays while she took credit? Should I go on? My father had gone pale. Emma, you don't understand. That money was for the family thing. That money was from my dead mother's life insurance policy, I'd said, my voice hard. It was meant for me, not for Hannah's dance classes, not for her designer clothes, not for her college tuition, for me. You have no proof, my stepmother had said, but her voice had wavered. I'd smiled. Actually, I have 3 years of documented proof. Photos, timestamps, copies of forged documents, recorded conversations. This was a bluff. I hadn't recorded conversations, but they didn't know that. And a very angry lawyer who specializes in elder and dependent abuse cases. So, I suggest you get your own lawyer. They tried to take my phone, my computer, anything they could get their hands on. But I'd expected that. Everything was backed up remotely. Everything was already in my lawyer's hands. The emancipation hearing had been scheduled for early May, 3 weeks away, but I wasn't done, not even close. Phase 2 had involved Hannah's college situation. I'd known that Cornell's Academic Integrity Office took plagiarism very seriously. I'd also known that they had sophisticated software for detecting it. From an anonymous email account, I'd sent Cornell's Academic Integrity Board a detailed report, copies of the essays I'd written for Hannah's college application, complete with timestamps from my Google Docs history showing I'd authored them, copies of papers she'd submitted in her classes that had been written by paid essay mills. She'd gotten sloppy once she was in college. I'd found the PayPal transactions on the family computer she'd used, a comprehensive dossier of academic fraud spanning her entire freshman and sophomore years. I'd included a simple note. I am a whistleblower concerned about academic integrity at your institution. I have reason to believe that Hannah Chen, student ID XXX, has engaged in systematic academic fraud. Please investigate. The investigation had started a week before my emancipation hearing. Phase 3 had been the most satisfying. Phoenix Technologies was growing faster than even I'd anticipated. By May 2018, we had 20 clients paying an average of $300 a month. That was $6,000 in monthly revenue, and our profit margins were around 70% because the software was largely automated once it was set up. Marcus and I had hired 2 additional developers, both remote contractors, and we'd started working on our second product, a cybersecurity suite for small businesses. I'd known from my first life that the cybersecurity market would explode in the early 2020s. We were positioning ourselves perfectly, but here's what my family didn't know. I'd convinced Marcus to transfer my ownership in Phoenix Technologies to a trust, one that I controlled but which wasn't in my name. My father couldn't touch it. My family couldn't claim it. It was mine, completely and totally mine. On my 18th birthday, I would officially take over as CEO. Marcus was happy to step back into a CTO role. He'd never wanted the administrative responsibility anyway. He'd get his 10% ownership and a healthy salary. I'd get my freedom and my company. The company that, by my calculations, would be worth about $2 million well within 2 years. The emancipation hearing had been brutal for my parents. They'd shown up with their own lawyer, a cheap divorce attorney who was clearly out of his depth. They'd tried to paint me as a troubled teen, as someone who was lying about abuse to gain access to money. But then, Janet had started presenting evidence. Bank statements showing $147,000 withdrawn from my trust fund over 11 years with forged signatures. Photos of the differential treatment. Hannah's closet full of designer clothes. My corner with garbage bags of thrift store rejects. Testimony from Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, about my near-daily presence at the library because I couldn't study at home. Records from my school showing I'd frequently come to class without lunch while Hannah posted Instagram photos of expensive restaurant meals. The credit card statements in my name, accounts I'd never opened, with my father's signature on the applications that didn't match mine. And then the coup de grace, the college essays. Janet had subpoenaed Hannah's college application, and we'd done a forensic analysis showing that the writing style, vocabulary, and even the typing patterns matched mine, not Hannah's. The judge had been furious. "Mr. Chen," she'd said, her voice icy, "I have seen many cases of financial abuse in this courtroom, but the systematic exploitation of a minor child, your own daughter, is particularly egregious. Not only am I granting this emancipation petition, I am also referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Fraud, forgery, identity theft, these are serious crimes." My father had tried to stammer out an excuse, but the judge had cut him off. "Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate forensic accounting of Emma's trust fund and ordering you to repay every penny you stole with interest. If you cannot pay, I will authorize liens against your property and wages. Do you understand?" He'd nodded, looking like he might vomit. To me, she'd said, "Miss Chen, you are hereby emancipated. You are legally an adult with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. I wish you the very best in your future. Based on the evidence I've seen here today, I have no doubt you'll go far." I'd walked out of that courtroom a free person for the first time in either of my lives. The fallout had been spectacular. Cornell had expelled Hannah 2 weeks later. The academic fraud investigation had uncovered not just the plagiarized application essays, but multiple instances of purchased papers and copied assignments. Her degree would never be completed, and the expulsion would be on her permanent record. She'd come home in disgrace, screaming that I'd ruined her life. "I ruined your life?" I'd said. I'd stopped by the house one last time to collect my remaining belongings. "You built your entire college career on my work. You stole my words, my stories, my achievements." "I didn't ruin your life, Hannah. You never had the life you thought you did. It was always mine." The district attorney had indeed pressed charges. My father was facing multiple felonies. My stepmother, as a co-conspirator who'd benefited from the fraud, was also charged. Their lawyer had advised them to take a plea deal. My father would serve 18 months in prison and be on probation for 5 years. My stepmother would get probation and community service. Both would have to pay full restitution, $147,000, plus interest, plus damages. They'd tried to negotiate. "We don't have that kind of money," their lawyer had told the DA. "Then they'll be paying it for the rest of their lives," the DA had responded. "Garnished wages, liens on property, seized assets. Miss Chen will get her money back one way or another." Their house, the house my mother's life insurance had helped pay for, I'd discovered, was already in foreclosure. They'd been living beyond their means for years. propped up by stolen money. Without my trust fund to drain, they were underwater. Hannah had to get a job at a retail store. She'd gone from Cornell student to shopping mall employee in a matter of weeks. Every time she tried to apply for another college, the expulsion showed up. Every time she tried to get a recommendation, her former professors had nothing good to say. I'd felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, not quite pity, but it had passed quickly. She'd had every advantage, every opportunity. She'd just never bothered to earn any of it herself. Meanwhile, Phoenix Technologies was exploding. By the time I turned 18 in June 2018, we had 50 clients and $15,000 in monthly recurring revenue. Our cybersecurity product had launched in beta, and the early response was phenomenal. We'd been accepted into a prestigious tech accelerator program, which came with $150,000 in seed funding and mentorship from successful founders. Marcus and I had moved the company to a small office space in downtown Seattle. I'd hired 5 full-time employees. We'd been featured in TechCrunch as a startup to watch. My 18th birthday had been the day I'd officially taken over as CEO. We'd had a small party in the office, just the team, some pizza, champagne for those over 21, and sparkling cider for me. "Speech," one of our developers had called out. I'd stood up looking around at these people who worked for me, who believed in the vision I'd created, who had no idea I'd been given a second chance at life and had used it to build all of this. 3 years ago, I'd said, I was a kid with nothing. No money, no support, no prospects. I was being told I wasn't worth investing in, that my dreams were too big, that I should be grateful for scraps. But I didn't accept that. I learned everything I could. I worked harder than I've ever worked at anything. I found people who believed in me, I'd nodded to Marcus, and I built something real. Phoenix Technologies exists because someone once tried to break me and failed. We're named Phoenix because I rose from the ashes of a life that tried to destroy me. And we're going to keep rising. We're going to become the premier cybersecurity and cloud optimization company for small businesses. We're going to make millions, and we're going to do it by being better, smarter, and more relentless than anyone else. They'd cheered. Marcus had clinked his champagne glass against my sparkling cider. "To Emma," he'd said, "the most terrifying 15-year-old I ever met, and the best CEO I could ask for." By the end of 2018, Phoenix Technologies had 200 clients and was generating $60,000 in monthly revenue. We were profitable. We had 15 employees. We'd closed a Series A funding round of $2 million, valuing the company at $10 million post-money. I was 18 years old, owned 81% of a $10 million company. Marcus had 10%, and we'd given some equity to early employees and investors. And I was a millionaire on paper, but more than that, I was free. I'd bought a small condo, nothing ostentatious, just a clean, safe space that was entirely mine. I'd enrolled in online courses at MIT through their distance learning program, studying computer science and business. I'd hired a financial advisor to help manage my wealth, and I'd set up trusts and investments to ensure I'd never be vulnerable again. The restitution payments from my father had started coming in, small amounts garnished from his wages at the construction job he'd taken after being released from prison. It would take him decades to pay back what he'd stolen, but every payment felt like justice. Hannah had tried to contact me a few times, emails that started with "I'm sorry," but quickly devolved into "Can you help me?" I deleted them all without responding. She'd made her choices. She'd built her life on stolen foundation. I owed her nothing. My stepmother had sent a single letter, claiming that she'd always loved me, that my father had forced her to go along with everything, that she'd been a victim too. I'd read it once, laughed bitterly, and thrown it away. Gaslighting didn't work when you had documentary evidence to the contrary. The moment I'd been waiting for had finally come in early 2019, almost a year after my emancipation. I'd been checking my old family home's address periodically through public records. I'd known it was in foreclosure, but I'd wanted to know when it would actually go to auction. The notice had appeared in February, bank-owned property, to be auctioned to the highest bidder. I'd called my real estate attorney. "I want to buy it." "Are you sure?" she'd asked. "Emma, that house has bad memories for you." "I'm not buying it for the memories," I'd said. "I'm buying it for the symmetry." I'd submitted a cash offer through a shell company, paying $50,000 above the appraised value to ensure no one else would get it. The bank had accepted immediately. In March 2019, I'd become the owner of the house where I'd been abused for 11 years. I'd had the locks changed immediately. Then I'd called my father. "You're being evicted," I'd said when he'd answered. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." There had been a long silence. "Emma, what are you talking about?" "I bought the house. It's mine now. You're being formally evicted. The notice will be served tomorrow, 30 days. After that, anything you leave behind becomes my property." "You can't." He'd started to bluster, but I'd cut him off. "I can. And I did. Dad, you stole my mother's money to buy this house. You raised me in it like a servant while you lavished everything on your new family. You stole from me, lied to me, broke me down systematically for over a decade. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" "Emma, please, where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know, and I don't care." "You have 30 days. I'd hung up. The eviction had gone exactly as planned. They'd tried to fight it, but they had no legal standing. I owned the house. They had no lease, no rental agreement, no rights. On the 30th day, I'd shown up with a moving truck and a cleanup crew. My father, stepmother, and Hannah had been standing on the lawn with a pile of hastily packed belongings. Hannah had been crying. My stepmother had looked older, harder. Her beauty curdled into bitterness. My father had just looked defeated. "Are you happy now?" Hannah had spat at me. "You've destroyed us, completely destroyed us. Do you feel good about yourself?" I'd looked at her for a long moment. In my first life, I would have felt guilty. I would have questioned whether I was the villain in this story, but I knew better now. "Hannah," I'd said, "I wrote your college essays. I did your homework. I gave you every advantage, and you never once said thank you. You wore clothes bought with my stolen inheritance and never questioned where the money came from. You watched your parents abuse me and did nothing. You're not a victim, you're a collaborator. I was just a kid. You were old enough to know right from wrong. You just didn't care because you were benefiting." I'd turned to my parents. "You had a daughter who was smart, hardworking, and desperate for your love. You could have raised me, supported me, helped me thrive. Instead, you saw me as a resource to exploit. You broke the law. You abused a child. You destroyed your own lives through your greed and cruelty. I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourselves." My stepmother had started to cry. "We have nowhere to go." "There are shelters," I'd said. "Food banks, social services. All the resources I had to learn about when you were taking my money and leaving me with nothing. You'll figure it out." I'd walked past them into the house, my house, and had started directing the cleanup crew. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every trace of them would be removed. I'd already hired an interior designer to completely renovate the space. By the time I'd come back outside, they'd been gone. Phoenix Technologies had continued to grow at an almost absurd rate. By late 2019, we had 500 clients and were generating $200,000 in monthly revenue. We'd expanded our product line to include 3 different cybersecurity solutions and 2 cloud optimization tools. We'd hired a sales team, a marketing department, and a customer success division. We'd moved to a proper office building with 50 employees. I'd been featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 Earning list. I'd given a TEDx talk about resilience and entrepreneurship. I'd been invited to speak at my old high school, an invitation I'd accepted because I wanted Mrs. Patterson and Ms. Rodriguez, the only 2 people who'd helped me, to see what I'd built. When I'd walked into that school as a keynote speaker, wearing a designer suit and carrying the confidence of someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar company, I'd felt the eyes on me. Former classmates who'd ignored me when I was poor and downtrodden suddenly wanted to reconnect. Teachers who'd written me off were congratulating themselves for always knowing I'd succeed. I'd been polite, but distant. They hadn't been part of my success. They'd been obstacles I'd overcome. Only Mrs. Patterson and Ms. Rodriguez had gotten my genuine warmth. After my speech, I'd taken them to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. "I never doubted you," Ms. Patterson had said, squeezing my hand. "Not for a single moment." "You saved my life," I'd told them both. "You were the only adults who saw me as a person worth saving. Everything I've built, I built partially on the foundation you gave me." I'd written them each a check for $50,000, a thank you that didn't come close to what they'd given me, but which they'd both initially refused, and which I'd insisted they accept. The years had continued to accelerate. By 2020, as the pandemic had hit and the world had gone digital, Phoenix Technologies had been perfectly positioned. Our cybersecurity and cloud solutions had become essential as companies scrambled to enable remote work. We'd gone from 500 clients to 2,000 clients in 6 months. We'd closed a Series B funding round of $15 million, valuing the company at $75 million. I'd been 20 years old and worth over $50 million on paper. I'd hired my father's construction company to do some renovation work on a property I'd bought. Not out of kindness, out of the sheer satisfaction of seeing him show up to a job site and realize his former daughter was now his boss. He'd aged badly. Prison and poverty had worn him down. He'd looked at me with something like fear. "Emma," he'd said, "thank you for the work." "Don't thank me," I'd said. "You're here because your company submitted the lowest bid and had decent reviews. Do good work, get paid, and we'll never have to interact beyond that." He'd nodded, something broken in his eyes. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I'd looked at him coldly. "It's not worth much, but I appreciate the sentiment. Your apology doesn't undo the damage, doesn't give me back my childhood, doesn't erase what you took from me. But at least you finally said it." He'd walked away, shoulders slumped, and I'd felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no sadness. Just the neutral acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. By 2021, Phoenix Technologies was being courted by major players for acquisition. Google had made an offer. Microsoft was interested. Amazon wanted to talk. The numbers being discussed were staggering. $200 million, $300 million, eventually $400 million. Marcus and I had sat in my office, the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle, and had discussed our options. "You could sell," he'd said. "Walk away with over $300 million. You'd never have to work again." "Is that what you want?" I'd asked. He'd shrugged. "I'm asking what you want. This was always your vision. I was just along for the ride." I'd thought about it. In my first life, I'd died with $247 in my bank account. In this life, I could sell and have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But money had never been the goal. Freedom had been the goal. Power had been the goal. The ability to never be vulnerable again had been the goal. "I don't want to sell," I'd said. "Not yet. We're just getting started." We'd turned down all the acquisition offers and had instead gone public in early 2022 with an IPO that valued Phoenix Technologies at $500 million. I'd retained 60% ownership after the public offering, making me worth about $300 million. At 22 years old, I'd been one of the youngest self-made female billionaires in tech. The stock price would climb and my paper wealth would eventually cross $1 billion. The house where I'd been abused, where I'd suffered, where I'd dreamed of escape, had been completely transformed. I'd gut renovated it, turning it into a modern masterpiece. The tiny room where I'd slept had been expanded into a home office. The kitchen where I'd been denied food was now a chef's paradise. Every trace of my old family had been erased. But I didn't live there. I kept it as a rental property, donating all the proceeds to charities supporting abused children and foster care programs. The symbolism was important to me. The place that had been my prison was now helping others escape their prisons. I'd heard through the grapevine that Hannah had eventually gotten her GED and was working her way through community college. She was 25, living with roommates, working 2 jobs. She'd never contacted me again after that final eviction. My stepmother had divorced my father while he was in prison. She'd moved to another state and, from what I'd heard, was working as a receptionist somewhere. Her social media had disappeared. She'd become as invisible as she'd once tried to make me. My father had finished paying his restitution in late 2024. Over 6 years of garnished wages, every penny of the $147,000 plus interest. The final payment had cleared just last month. He was 62 now, still working construction, living in a small apartment, alone. I'd received a letter from him after the final payment. Emma, I've paid back the money, though I know that doesn't repay the damage. I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I think about what I did every single day. I was a coward and a thief. I failed you as a father in every possible way. I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. Dad. I'd read it 3 times. Then I'd filed it away with all the other documentation from that part of my life. Maybe someday I'd feel ready to respond. Maybe not. But the letter had given me something I'd needed. The acknowledgement that I'd been right. That what had happened to me had been real, had been wrong, had been their fault. Now, sitting in my corner office in late 2024, watching Hannah unwrap the laptop my parents had given her, the laptop I'd left behind intentionally, loaded with monitoring software. I smiled. She had no idea that every keystroke she made was being logged. Every password she entered, every website she visited, every document she created. I wasn't planning to do anything with the information. I didn't need to. She was already living with the consequences of her choices, but having that access, having that knowledge, having that power over her, it was a reminder of how far I'd come. I'd started this second life with nothing. I'd been reborn into abuse and poverty and neglect, but I'd had one unfair advantage. I'd known the future, and I'd known what I was capable of. I'd used that advantage to build an empire. Phoenix Technologies now had 5,000 clients, 200 employees, and a market cap of $2 billion. I was 24 years old and worth approximately $1.2 billion. I'd been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. I'd started a foundation supporting foster children and abuse survivors. I'd bought my mother's childhood home, the one she'd grown up in before she'd married my father, and had turned it into a retreat center for women escaping domestic violence. I'd taken everything they'd tried to take from me and had multiplied it 1,000-fold. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was Marcus. Emma, the acquisition team from Oracle is here for the meeting. Are you ready? I closed the surveillance app showing Hannah's laptop feed and stood up, smoothing my suit jacket. I'm ready, I said. We weren't selling, but it was always good to hear what people thought we were worth. I walked into the conference room where a team of executives waited to try to convince me to give them my company. They had no idea that the young woman walking in had died once before, had been abused and broken and left with nothing. They had no idea that I'd been reborn with a gift. The gift of foresight, of knowing what was coming, of being able to build exactly the right company at exactly the right time. They had no idea that nothing they could offer me would be enough because I wasn't building Phoenix Technologies for money. I was building it as a monument to survival, as proof that you could be knocked down, destroyed, left, with nothing, and still rise. As a reminder to myself and to anyone who'd ever tried to break me, I was unbreakable. And I had won. Epilogue. 5 years later, in 2029, Phoenix Technologies was acquired by Google for $8 billion. I was 29 years old and walked away with $4.8 billion after taxes. I immediately invested $2 billion into my foundation, which now operated shelters, provided legal aid, and offered educational scholarships to abuse survivors across the country. I'd helped thousands of kids who'd been where I was, trapped, exploited, dreaming of escape. My father had reached out one more time after the acquisition was announced. He'd written, "I don't expect you to see me or forgive me, but I wanted you to know that your mother would be so proud of you. She always knew you were special. I'm sorry I forgot that." This time, I'd written back. Just 3 words. I know she would. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement. It was closure. Hannah had sent an email too. It was longer, full of apologies and regrets and explanations. She was 31 now, had finally finished her bachelor's degree at a state school, was working as a marketing coordinator somewhere. She wrote about therapy, about understanding what she'd been complicit in, about trying to become a better person. At the end, she'd written, "I don't expect anything from you. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I understand now what we took from you. And I understand that the only reason I have any kind of life at all is because you were strong enough to break free and force us all to face consequences. You saved yourself, but in a way, you saved me too. You made me have to actually become a real person instead of a parasite." I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. Hannah. I'd read it several times. There was something genuine in it, something that felt different from the self-serving apologies of the past. I'd written back, Hannah, I appreciate your honesty. I'm not ready for a relationship, and I may never be. What you and our parents did caused damage that doesn't just disappear because people say sorry. But I'm glad you're building a real life on your own merits now. That's what you should have been doing all along. I hope you continue to grow and do better. Emma, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was more than I'd ever thought I'd offer. I'd stood in front of the house one last time before transferring its ownership to my foundation to use as transitional housing for abuse survivors. The house where I'd suffered, where I'd been small and broken and desperate. I was 30 years old now, 10 years older than I'd been when I'd died in my first life. I'd built a $1 billion company. I'd changed thousands of lives. I'd proven that you could rise from the ashes of the worst abuse and become something extraordinary. I'd been given a gift, a second chance, knowledge of the future, the ability to right the wrongs done to me. And I'd used it. Not just for revenge, though there had been that too, but for justice, for freedom, for proof that they'd been wrong about me. I wasn't worthless. I wasn't forgettable. I wasn't someone to be used and discarded. I was Phoenix, and I'd risen.